Welcome everyone to a video on the commander ban list. Today I'm going to be talking about the commander ban list in the context of cEDH. Wizards of the Coast and the Commander Format panel recently released the first 5 brackets of the commander ban list, and the 5th bracket, cEDH, is the one we're going to be talking about today. They hinted at potentially some unbans coming in the next couple of months, potentially cards moving from the ban list to the Game Changers list, which is, of course, a new bracket of cards that they have announced. We're going to be talking about which cards, if they move to the Game Changers, are going to shape or change or impact that bracket number 5. And we will be talking about every card on the ban list today. If you are not familiar with all the cards, it would be wise to have a Scryfall tab open and just pause the video if you don't know what a card does to go give it a look. Obviously, cards that are banned typically don't see a lot of play, so you may not be familiar with all of them, but I will do my best to briefly touch on each card as we go through them. And of course, because I don't believe in clickbait, GRISELBRAND is cEDH viable. So this question here, not rhetorical. It is viable, and we'll talk about why. Before we dive into it, I want to talk about the methodology that I'm using to discuss the commander ban list. First off, I want to break all cards up into 3 tiers. So the first tier, the most powerful, we will talk about them last because they're the most interesting. These are cards that would define the format. They would define cEDH as, you know, the format as it exists right now would not be the same if these cards were let loose into cEDH. It would change which decks are viable. It would change the strategies that people use. There would be either new strategies introduced or some strategies wiped off the face of the earth if these cards were brought into the metagame. The second tier are cards that would see widespread play in many, many decks. So they would go, you know, all across all sorts of top tier decks and would see a ton of play, but they aren't going to fundamentally change what the format looks like at the highest level of play. The third tier are cards that would not see widespread play. Obviously, there's a deck for every card. So someone out there is going to find a way to make one of these cards be playable or reasonable in a cEDH deck, but it's not going to see widespread play across a wide variety of top tier decks. The second pillar that I'm using is that the metagame is static, so we are not considering unbanning multiple cards. So only one card. If we talked about this one card coming off, you know, there's a lot of cross effects. You know, if we unban 5 Moxen all at once, that's going to change the format fundamentally in a way that is meaningful. But if we only unban one card and we will only unban 1 Mox, then that's not going to fundamentally change the format. You know, it basically looks like what Mana Crypt does, but we'll get into more of those details later. But fundamentally, we're only unbanning one card at a time. We're not talking about the cross effects of multiple cards coming off the list at once. Second, we're not talking about banning any existing cards. So there's a whole video that I can make talking about which cards should be banned, why should they be banned, what would make a balanced or competitive format, la da da da. That's not what this video is about. So we're assuming that the format exists as it is right now, and one of these cards, you know, consecutively, we'll go through all of them, enters the ban list, or enters the unbanned list, you know, and what would happen there. Lastly, we're not talking about the anti-cards, we're not talking about conspiracy cards or the culturally insensitive cards. These are banned for other reasons, and we could discuss why they're banned, but the most of the point is we're not going to be talking about them because they are not cards that really make sense for Commander for a number of different reasons. So we're not talking about them. There's 3 special mentions. These are cards that don't fall into any tier: Chaos Orb, Falling Star, and Scheherazade. Chaos Orb and Falling Star are manual dexterity cards. They are cards that have an impact on the game based on what happens to the physical locations of cards. You either flip the cards or you drop them from a certain height, and those types of mechanics don't see play in modern games of Magic in any format for a reason. They will stay banned. If they were unbanned, they're not particularly strong, so I'd say probably tier 3. But the idea of having to rearrange cards on the board is a bit of a messy and not well-defined component of this game. So they're not really cards that we would ever see come off the ban list for those reasons. And then Scheherazade creates a sub-game, which is the most like horrific, time-consuming possible effect. You have to play an entire additional game of cEDH before you can determine the outcome of the Scheherazade spell. So imagine midway through your cEDH game, you now have to stop and play another game of cEDH to determine which players lose half their life. And that's it. That's all Scheherazade does, is it loses a player half their life. So this card is not, one, not very good, and two, disgustingly time consuming. So also not a card that we would ever see come off the ban list for those types of reasons. A little bit about my background. I've been playing a lot. I've played a lot of No Ban List. About 5 years ago, oh my god, that's a long time ago, I founded the No Ban List server. So in that time, I played over 550 games of No Ban List. So I've played with every card on the ban list in Commander. If you search for Commander decks with Black Lotus in the main board, the top 3 results are all my No Ban List decks. So I played No Ban List on a couple different channels. I've written about it before. I guess I should probably update these power levels to 5 here for Maricil and Leovold. But yeah, I've played a lot with these banned cards, so I hopefully have some insight to add to the discussion about which cards would be good in cEDH. Let's talk about the metagame that I'm going to be referring to. I went to EDH Top 16 and looked at the decks that are the most well represented, and these are those decks. So don't be offended if your deck's not on here. This is broadly the metagame I'm referring to when I talk about top tier decks. These are the decks that people are choosing to play a lot of. How well they do isn't really part of the discussion, but these are the decks that are seeing some of the greatest amount of tournament play. Tymna Thrasios, Kinnan, Rogsai. These 4 decks by themselves stand out in my mind as sort of the top tier, the decks that people play the most, that I see a ton of in tournaments, that I'm thinking the most to prepare for. More further on down the line, of course, Sisse, Magda, Tivit, Yuriko, Najeela, Kenrith, Derevi, Atraxa. These are all very strong commander-centric decks. Rog, Thrasios, Malcolm, Vile, of course, more partner decks. So pretty standard, a couple 2-color decks, just the single Magda is the monocolor deck, and then lots of 3, 4, 5-color piles, partner piles, all that type of stuff. So these are the commanders that I will be primarily thinking about and talking about with regards to cards that we unban. Let's talk about Tier 3, diving right into it. These are sorted alphabetically. We will talk about them in alphabetical order, simply because I find it convenient to paste them from the website in that way. Starting off with Biorhythm. Biorhythm is an 8-mana sorcery that causes players' life totals to become the amount of creatures they control. This card is terrible. There are very, very few decks that have 8 mana to spare. Even fewer decks that have 8 mana to spare and have very low creature counts. The reason you would play Biorhythm is to essentially kill players, reduce their life total very close to 0 or to 0. So something like a board wipe into you play a creature, into you Biorhythm, your opponents die. That would be something that I would see being viable in cEDH, but it requires such a ludicrous amount of mana. I think it would only really make sense in mono green decks, and there are no mono green decks in the metagame that we discussed. So this card lives at tier 3 and probably would not see much play. The only deck that I can think of in the top group that would play it is Kinnan, and you'll notice Kinnan is a bit of an outlier as we go through this list. Kinnan could probably play way more cards on this list than most other decks because it's a deck that makes a ton of mana and is green, which are two of the constraints that you will find as we go through this list here. Braid's Cabal Minion is a mono-black potential commander that makes people sacrifice permanents. Braid's Arisen Nightmare is another Braids that they printed. Braids is a 4-mana mono-black commander that interacts with your opponents slowly. It can be a little bit... it's basically a mono-black stacks commander, and there's no stacks decks in our top pods these days. This metagame is too fast and too strong and too grindy for the sacrificing of a permanent each turn to be particularly prohibitive. Braids is obnoxious in casual because if it comes down relatively early, land, Soul Ring land, Braids, it puts people back on resources over a long period of time. We play so many permanents so quickly that for the most part, Braids' impact isn't particularly meaningful. So I don't imagine it would see much play either as a commander or in the main board. Coalition Victory is an 8-mana sorcery. Interesting how many of those we have on the banned list. 8-mana sorcery that wins the game if you have a land of every basic land type and a creature of every color. So if you control a Child of Alara and 2 Triomes that span all 5 card types and you have 8 mana, you win the game. It's easy to do, obviously. It's also not very good. There are no commanders in our list, I don't think. Let me jump back. Our metagame. None of these commanders are 5 colors. Yeah, because the two, Najeela, Sisay, and Kenrith. Yeah, Najeela, Sisay, Kenrith are the only 5 color commanders, and none of them are actual factual all 5 colors. So this card would not see play in any deck that we have in the metagame right now. You'd have to build a deck around it, and you have to have all the basic lands, which means you need to fetch untapped, tapped triomes. And this card is 8 mana, and it's a sorcery. So this card's pretty bad. It would not see much, if any, play. Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. There are not really any Eldrazi that see play right now. Emrakul likely would not be much of an exception. Emrakul is obviously the strongest of them. It takes an extra turn when you cast it. But this is not a format where cheating things out with Sneak Attack or Through the Breach is viable, and hardcasting a 15-mana spell is not as good as hardcasting a 3-mana Rhystic Study. So I don't think that we would see much Emrakul. Certainly the only deck on the list that would play it would be something like Kinnan, and I don't know if Kinnan has any reason to flip into an Emrakul over something like a Void Winnower or a Tidespout Tyrant or something like that. Areo Soratami Ascendant. This is a card that I think people overestimate its strength. The challenge with Areo basically is a 2-mana creature that if you play 4 or more spells in a turn, it flips. And when it's on the flip side, the first spell each opponent casts each turn is countered. The biggest problem with Areo is that it is very much like Defense Grid, in that your opponents who previously could interact with each other no longer can do so very practically, because they have to throw a spell into the Areo before they can counter something. I could see Areo seeing play in something like a Rogsai, where on your combo turn, you're just going to cast Rock, flip Areo, and that'll allow you to basically nullify the first counterspell from each of your opponents. The problem is that putting Areo in the command zone makes it impossible for your opponents to interact with each other in any practical way. And when somebody goes to win the game with an Areo in play, they just play like a Chrome Mox, it gets countered, and then they can play normally. So I could see Areo seeing some niche play, maybe in a Rogsai deck. I would need to see testing on that. But for the most part, Areo is not a good control commander, and it would not see a lot of play in the main deck. The only other scenario I could see it seeing play is like Rule of Law stacks decks, which are not in the metagame right now. Areo plus a Rule of Law means that your opponent's first spell is countered each turn, which is, of course, the only spell they're allowed to play thanks to Rule of Law. But in setting up an A plus B combo like that doesn't win the game is 2 mana, and you have to cast 4 spells, and you have to then have a Rule of Law, which you cast after, because otherwise how are you going to cast 4 spells? It's pretty niche. I don't think this card's going to see a lot of play. Iona, Shield of Emeria. If you are reanimating a spell or cheating a card into play, that card in cEDH wins the game. Iona does not win the game, and it's not green or blue. So it's not going to see play in Kinnan, and it's not going to be a prime reanimation target over something like, Razaketh or Lord Forbid Griselbrand. Usually cards that are being polymorphed into, like Tidespout or Hullbreaker Horror. Like, these cards win the game. Iona does not do that. So this would not see a lot of play. Limited Resources is a card that makes each player sacrifice lands if they have more than 5, and if there are 10 or more lands on the battlefield, you cannot play more lands. It's a 1-mana white enchantment. Basically, this is something that you play on turn 1, and then no player can play, 2 players get 3 lands, 2 players get 2 lands, and then nobody gets to play any more lands. So it's good for mana denial. Mono White Stacks would play this card if Mono White Stacks was a deck that saw play. The other problem with Limited Resources is that this is a format filled with Mana Rocks and Dorks, which are things that get ahead on mana despite being limited on lands. I don't think that Limited Resources would see much play because the types of decks that are trying to do resource denial are not decks that see much viable play. Panoptic Mirror is a 5-mana artifact that has X tap, exile an instant or sorcery. At the beginning of your upkeep, cast a copy of that instant or sorcery. X is the mana value of the spell. The reason this card is good is because you can pay 5 mana to cast it, and then 5 mana to tap it and exile a turn spell, and then on your upkeep, you win the game, because you take an extra turn after this one for free, and then on the turn following that, you take an extra turn after this one for free, and then on the turn following that, and that goes on forever. Panoptic Mirror was mostly banned because people would put cards like, Wrath of God, so every single upkeep you'd Wrath the board, but this card would not see a lot of play because there's not a lot of decks that have 5 colorless mana and then 5 colorless mana tap. to start a 2-card A plus B combo that loses to any sort of artifact interaction, and you can still counter the spell that it casts. So this card is just kind of niche. There's not a lot of decks that can make that type of mana, and not a lot of decks that want to play the B parts of this combo. So it wouldn't slot into many decks. Primeval Titan. This card makes a lot of mana. It allows you to tutor lands. Lands combos are not really much of a thing in cEDH. Dark Depths Thespian Stage is definitely a cool thing to do in other formats, but not so much here. Primeval Titan would absolutely see play in some mono-green ramp decks that are trying to ramp into big things. Maybe it sees play in Kinnan if there's enough utility lands to justify it. It does make a lot of mana. It does get a lot of powerful lands, Gaia's Cradle, Minamo, stuff like that. But I think by and large, this card would not see much play because 6 mana, put 2 lands into play, doesn't really do much in this format. Recurring Nightmare. We already have Chthonian Nightmare. The big difference between Recurring Nightmare and Chthonian Nightmare is that Chthonian Nightmare cannot reanimate big things, is vulnerable to enchantment hate, and costs 1 mana less. And Chthonian Nightmare doesn't see play, and Recurring Nightmare, flickering very large creatures, doesn't do much. The best thing you could do with Recurring Nightmare for a very long time was Dockside, which obviously is banned now and would not be coming off the list in this hypothetical world. And even if you were to be looping Dockside with it, you'd rather be looping it with Chthonian Nightmare because Chthonian Nightmare is cheaper. So Recurring Nightmare would not see much, if any, play at the cEDH level. Raphelos, Lawn of War Emissary, is a 2-green, 2/1 that taps for 1 green mana for each forest you control, so it makes a lot of mana. The problem is, making a lot of mana isn't very good. There are no mono-green decks in our metagame. Our metagame analysis, this would absolutely see play in mono-green decks. Mono-green decks would play it. Probably there would be mono-green decks that play Raphelos as the commander. Mono-green is not in our cEDH metagame at the time of composing this, and unless it does, Raphelos would not see mainstream play. Only viable in mono-green decks mono-green decks are not very viable. Sundering Titan is an 8 mana, 8/10 that destroys a basic land of each type when it enters and when it leaves. This card does not do anything. 8 mana, 8/10, who cares about those things? It destroys basic lands, lands with basic land types. Again, maybe Kinnan wants to flip into it and blow up a bunch of your opponent's lands, but it doesn't hit Mana Confluence, City of Brass. It only hits, original duels and shocks. So I just don't imagine that there's much you're going to be doing with a Sundering Titan in this format. Sway of the Stars is a 7 mana, 8 mana. Oh, it's a 10 mana. It's a 10 mana sorcery that doesn't do anything. We've been over this. Sway of the Stars basically resets the game. Each player shuffles all of their permanents into their library and then draws 7 cards, and then life totals become 7. So you just reset the game, but everybody has 7 life instead of their starting life. This is a 10 mana sorcery. It doesn't do much in cEDH. Sylvan Primordial is a card that probably does see a non-zero amount of play in Kinnan. Now that I think about it, Sylvan Primordial might be the strongest card on this list and probably the closest to moving to tier 2. Sylvan Primordial is a 7 mana 5/7 with reach or something. But when it enters the battlefield, it destroys a non-creature permanent each opponent controls, and you search your library for a forest and put it on the battlefield. So you can blow up lands, you can blow up Rhystic Studies. In fact, let me just confirm really quick that I'm talking about this correctly. Because the fact that it can blow up Rhystic Study and Smothering Ties is pretty strong. 7 mana, 6/8 with reach. Destroy target non-creature permanent for each opponent. And then for all the ones you destroy, you get a basic land. Or a forest card, not even a basic land. So, you flip into this, you blow up 3 non-creature permanents your opponents control, and you ramp 3 lands. That's probably actually cEDH playable in Kinnan. So, I think that's the strongest card. Originally, this card was banned because you just flicker it. You'd be like, oh, I get to ramp and I get to blow up my opponent's lands. Great. I'm going to do it again with Deadeye Navigator or whatever it may be. So, this card might actually see play in cEDH, and definitely the closest to tier 2 of any card on this list. Trade Secrets. I want to talk about Trade Secrets last because it's definitely the heftiest of all the cards on this list. So we'll jump forward to Upheaval. Upheaval is a 6 mana sorcery that returns all permanents to their owner's hand. Cyclonic Rift is Upheaval, but it bounces your opponent's things, but not lands. Upheaval is banned because it bounces lands, so it resets the game. The way to abuse Upheaval is to have 6 mana plus a bunch of extra mana, so you get to play all of your spells out quicker than your opponents do. The problem is you have to have 6 mana, and your opponents have to choose not to interact with it. And all your opponents that play rocks can deploy their rocks out quickly. Upheaval is just not very strong because you have to have a copious amount of mana and be able to outplay your opponents in terms of redevelopment. And it's awfully hard for me to imagine that there's many decks that can take advantage of an Upheaval. Last but certainly not least, not least, Trade Secrets. Trade Secrets is a game theory card. It's a 3-mana card that says you draw 2 cards and target player draws 4 cards. They may choose to, or maybe it's you draw 4. Now, let me look it up. I want to make sure I know exactly what it does. Target opponent draws 2, then you draw up to 4. Then you may draw up to 4. They may repeat this process any number of times. So, 3-mana sorcery, target opponent draws 2, you draw 4. If that was all the card did, it probably wouldn't be that good. 3 mana, draw 4. That's not a ton of cards. I mean, it's fine. Like it might see play. Drawing 4 cards is pretty good. But the piece that makes this card complex and the reason that's banned in Commander is that opponent may repeat this process as many times as they choose. So if you draw 4 and your opponent draws 2, they can say, hey, I want to draw 2 more. And then you draw 4 more. And then they say, hey, I want to draw 2 more. And then you draw 4 more. So your opponent could draw 6 and you draw 12. Or your opponent could draw 8 and you draw 16, and so on and so forth. If it is your turn on the main phase and you cast Trade Secrets, and your opponent chooses to draw their library, you also draw your library. That's how Trade Secrets works. You do not lose the game, you don't deck out, but you do draw up to as many cards as you want if they decide to draw their library. And too often what would happen is in Commander, Trade Secrets would be played, and it would then be 2 players who are playing the game and 2 players who are not playing the game. It's very similar to when there are 2 consecrated sphinxes on the battlefield, where both players inevitably end up drawing almost all the cards in their library. If you are the player casting Trade Secrets, and it is your main phase, you only cast Trade Secrets if you think that your opponent, when they draw their library, cannot beat you, right? Because if you cast Trade Secrets and you think your opponent will have enough interaction to beat you with a full hand, with your entire deck in your hand, then you wouldn't cast it. So it's empirically true that if you think that your opponent would win, you don't cast it. So when it is cast, you are stating to the table, definitionally, I think that if I draw my whole library, I will win the game. And if your opponents know that what you're stating is, I can win the game and there's nothing you can do to stop me if I cast this Trade Secrets, they will never choose to draw their library. Which means that the game theory optimal strategy for Trade Secrets is 100% of the time, this card reads, target player draws 2, you draw 4. So the entire second half of the text, the opponent can repeat this process. That component is essentially irrelevant. It will never happen if players are playing optimally. The only scenario in which it happens is if both players think that they, with a full grip, could beat their opponent's full grip with their entire library in their hand. And typically, you choose the player who isn't a blue player to target with Trade Secrets. If I cast Trade Secrets and I target, Magda, then certainly Magda won't win, or whatever it may be. But if I target a player like, Eureka, which has a ton of, blue interaction, that might be different. By and large, Trade Secrets would not do much. 95% of the time, this card reads 3 mana, draw 4 cards, which probably is not good enough for cEDH outside of some niche play. All right. This is, I think, the most controversial tier, Tier 2. Kicking us off, Ancestral Recall, one of the Power 9, the first Power 9 we've seen, not the only Power 9 in Tier 2. Ancestral Recall is a card that would see play in every blue deck, period. It is incorrect to sleeve up a blue deck and not sleeve up Ancestral Recall. Now, you might say to yourself, wow, that seems very strong. You're right, it is. You might even say, wow, I think that's format warping. It's not. Ancestral Recall is a very strong card. It draws you 3 cards for 1 mana. cEDH is defined by value engines and very quick kills. Neither of those 2 things are Ancestral Recall. Ancestral Recall's primary value is digging yourself out of a mulligan hole, right? If you're mulled a 4, turn 1 and cast Ancestral Recall, you're back up. There's not really any way to abuse Ancestral Recall. Tymna draws as many cards during the draw step as Ancestral Recall, and that one doesn't cost any mana once it's in play. cEDH games are defined by the value engines that you're able to deploy, the speed at which you're able to deploy them, and the gate very often in cEDH is mana, more so than it is cards, because we have so many cards that draw so many other cards, like Mystic Study and Mystic Gamora. So, Ancestral Recall absolutely would not be healthy to add another blue staple to every single blue deck, but it would not fundamentally change cEDH. It would just make blue decks better, empirically, objectively, and you should play it if it's unbanned. But it's not going to fundamentally change the format, therefore it's not a tier 1 card. It also doesn't really change which decks are or are not viable. Like, Tymna Kraum is still going to be viable with Ancestral Recall. Magda would still be viable even if Tymna Kraum has Ancestral Recall. It's not fundamentally changing anything. Balance. The next card on the list is Balance. Balance is a 2-mana sorcery that makes each player sacrifice lands, sacrifice creatures, and discard cards from hand to whomever has the lowest number of all of those respective things. So, for example, you have 3 cards in hand. Each other player will need to discard until they have 3 cards in hand. If a different player has 1 card in hand, then each player is going to have to discard down to 1. What makes Balance good is that it depletes the table's resources at a very efficient rate. And it also does not count artifacts or enchantments. So if your deck is catered to jamming a bunch of mana rocks out and then casting a Balance, you get to destroy lands if your opponents have more than you, sacrifice creatures if they have more than you, and discard cards from their hand if they have more than you. So the ideal Balance turn is, play a land, play a bunch of rocks, cast a Balance with, 2 cards in hand, and then each opponent discards down to 2 cards in hand and, sacrifices. You have to sacrifice your land in that scenario if you're playing it on turn 1. I think Balance would see play for sure in decks that play as many rocks as humanly possible. So I don't think there's any metagame specific decks that we talked about that will be playing it. Tivit maybe, because it's got a ton of rocks. Like Kenrith maybe. Derevi probably, because Derevi's sort of a resource restriction deck. But by and large, Balance absolutely would see some play. It would not be particularly meaningful to changing the format, and its strength cannot be overstated. People underestimate how strong Balance is when it just cleans up so much. It's a 2-mana Wrath of God if one player has few creatures, and it creates incredible resource parity. So it's a card that's very strong from behind, and there's not a lot of cards that are particularly strong from behind. Especially not as strong as Balance. One player has been ran away with a Mystic Study. They have 12 cards in hand. Cool, Balance. Now everybody has 3. That's a pretty significant resource swing. So it is the sheer swinginess of Balance that makes it so strong. And especially if you're able to, deploy a Balance with no creatures in play, sacrifice some lands, and then play a commander, that's where Balance is going to shine. So I would definitely imagine it seeing play. I'm not sure if it would go all the way into the top tier decks, but it's a very strong card. Next up on our list is Channel. Channel would absolutely see play, especially in Thrasios decks. Channel is a 2-mana green sorcery that says pay 1 life, make 1 colorless mana. It basically says make 20-something colorless mana for 2 mana. That is just an incredible resource swing. It is very powerful to be able to to move life into cards, which we regularly do in this format. With cards like Ad Nauseam and Necropotence, it is much harder to turn life into mana. Again, cEDH is a format that is gated by mana, not as much by cards. So a card that says convert, make close to infinite mana, that's pretty strong. Channel has the trait of being able to activate Thrasios, so Channel immediately would slot into Thrasios decks. Channel plus Thrasios is pay 4 life, scry 1, draw a card, and then any colorless rocks you find, you can also pay for them. You can just cast them. So if you don't have a ton of mana, you don't need that much colorless mana because all colorless costs basically don't exist. Channel would see a lot of play. It is very strong. Would not fundamentally warp. Thrasios is already viable. It wouldn't become S tier because of Channel, but it would definitely see a lot of play and it would be very strong. Fast Bond is another card that would just see play in every single Turbo Ad Nauseam deck that also plays green. which I don't think there are any right now at the top of the metagame. Atraxa maybe, but any deck that wants to play explosive hands. Fast Bond basically says that if your opening hand contains a Fast Bond and a land or two, you get to ramp as if you were playing, a Mana Crypt or a Soul Ring. And Fast Bond being able to turn that on is great. And of course, when you accumulate lots of cards from Mystic Studies and Mystic Remoras, Fast Bond is the best way to just get way ahead on mana. How often do you discard a hand size, discard 2 or 3 lands because you're keeping one in your hand? Well, now Fast Bond just says you can play all of them every time. The low price of 1 life per land, basically irrelevant. Fast Bond would see a lot of play. Very good in decks like Gitrog or Tatyova, but those are not top tier decks. Would absolutely see play in 4-color pile though. Gifts Ungiven is a blue-black-red combo card that would instantly be slammed into Rogsai and Tymna Kraum. Instantly. It would never leave those decks ever again. The Gifts Ungiven pile, there are 2 notable piles for Gifts Ungiven, both of them contained within Grixis. The first one, well, I guess one of them contained within Grixis, the other one contained within Sans Green. Or I guess just within Jeskai. So there's the Breach pile, Sevinne's, Breach, LED, Brain Freeze. That would be, that's kind of one of the default gifts piles for the Breach. It's also, 3/4 of the Intuition pile. Of course, you get to just add the 4th piece in every single time with gifts, but 3 of those 4 cards are typically what you find with Intuition piles. One of the lines that gifts opens up that Intuition does not is the Thoracle pile. So Snapcaster Mage, Thassa's Oracle, Reanimate, and Demonic Consultation. If that is your pile, no matter what happens, you untap and with 5 mana get to Oracle Consult. So end step gifts for 4, untap, win the game. That's pretty strong. Gifts, of course, has lots of other miscellaneous piles that can exist. Something like Sevinne's, Grand Abolisher, Rhystic Study, Mystic Remora is a pretty nasty pile. Sevinne's, Grand Abolisher, Cavern of Souls, Ranger Captain Evios. No matter how you swing it, they have to give you either Cavern plus Sevinne's, which means you get 2 opportunities to pick up one of your silence effects. Like Gifts is very strong in that you can, it's basically a 4 mana 2/2, and a lot of the time those cards are all you need. Intuition is one fewer mana, but 1 fewer card, and that extra card going to hand opens up a lot of very strong piles. So Gifts isn't going to fundamentally warp the metagame around it, but it would absolutely see play in a lot of high-tier decks. Some of you old heads out there will have played with Golos back before it got banned. I do remember the Golos days. This card is not meaningfully exceptional in cEDH above Kenrith, Najeela, or Sisay, but it is a 5-color commander, and 5-color commanders are very good. Golos has the ability to have a land toolbox, so lots of lands that are strong. Beseiju, being able to be found off of Golos, allows you to cast uncounterable ad nauseams. I'm sure there's other lands that are relevant as well. Golos is mostly an infinite mana sink, so as long as you haven't exiled your win conditions, if you have infinite mana of any color, you can put it into Golos. It's decent value engine. It's 7 mana to spin. Maybe it's 8 mana to spin, but 8 Wooburg or 7 Wooburg. Card's good. It would absolutely see play in Commander if it was unbanned. It's a 5-color commander and it's strong. But it's not notable, and it wouldn't be that particularly. It wouldn't be stronger than I think Kenrith, Sisay, and Najeela, but it would be on par. You do not have to have been playing for very long to know what Jeweled Lotus does. It does not warp the format. It clearly, changes the format when it got banned a month ago. Card's very strong. It would absolutely see play. It is not going to fundamentally change the metagame as a whole. Low-cost commanders are still a hugely relevant portion. Kinnan, Sisay, Magda, Tivit, Yuriko. Tivit and Atraxa are 2 of the ones most impacted by the Jeweled Lotus ban. They are still played. Kraum was impacted by the Jeweled Lotus ban. It is still played. We're not talking about changing cEDH in any distinct way, other than it's strong and it would make decks that are being cast, commander-oriented decks stronger if they're being cast. I think Leovold is one of the cards that people are the most excited to see unbanned because it's been a very long time since Leovold was legal. Leovold would be a top-tier commander. Absolutely, it would be one of the cards that we talk about in the metagame, instantaneously, overnight. Leovold is strong because it is a one half of an A plus B combo, the other half being Time Twister, Windfall, Dark Deal, or most fun, Teferi's Puzzle Box. Teferi's Puzzle Box says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, they put all the cards in their hand on the bottom of their library and then draw cards equal to that number. Maybe it's in their draw step. Either way, doesn't matter. The point is, I think it's in their draw step, yeah. So that you draw for turn, and then you put all the cards in your hand on the bottom of your library, and then you draw no cards. So you have to have an instant that you draw during the draw step when you draw your card for turn. If you do not draw an instant that interacts with Leovold or the puzzle box, you have no cards in hand every single turn because Leovold says your opponents can't draw cards. So it has an A plus B, pseudo lock that has to be beaten by, Boseiju, Odawara, Abrupt Decay, Sword Splashers, any sort of removal spell. And then it also just has the ability to wheel your opponent to nothing. The number one thing that I would see Leovold doing to the metagame is putting a lot of pressure on Tymna Kraum, putting a lot of pressure on Tymna Thrasios. It was not going to have as much of an impact on Rogside because Rogside's got a Nauseam and Necro, but basically it takes those Rhystic Study decks, and especially those Tymna decks, and just puts a massive nerf on them. So right now, decks that draw cards do very well. Leovold would put a ton of pressure on those decks to up their removal suite to be able to interact with the Leovold, because otherwise their engines are going to be shut out. I think it would make decks like Kinnan and Sisei a lot stronger because those decks, Magda, Yuriko, those decks either get value without having to draw cards or just don't care about the axis of drawing cards at all. So we would definitely see those decks getting stronger, those Tymna decks getting nerfed. I frankly think Leovold would be a pretty healthy addition to the metagame, just putting some real pressure on hands that are overly reliant on Rhystic Study, because very shortly thereafter, Rhystic Study is going to draw. Rhystic Study only gets to draw one card per turn. So you will still draw off it. It still will be strong. But if people pay, people will let Rhystic Study players draw one card and then cast 4 spells without having to pay. That's going to make a pretty significant difference. So you will notice Hullbreacher is not on Tier 2. It's in Tier 1. We'll talk about the differences between Leovold and Hullbreacher when we get to Tier 1. Library of Alexandria is a land that draws you a card when you tap it if you have exactly 7 cards in hand. It also taps for a colorless mana. Library of Alexandria has almost no downside. That's why it's in Tier 2. It would see play in almost every single deck, certainly every single deck that is fewer than 3 colors for sure, almost certainly in every 3-color deck, and very likely in all 4 and 5-color decks, because the worst case scenario for Library is that it's a colorless land, and the upside is drawing an additional card every single turn. That's it. It's a generically powerful card that would just see play because it has almost no downside. Speaking of cards that are very generically powerful that would see play because they have almost no downside, Lutri the Spellchanger. Lutri is a companion that can be your companion if you have no 2 cards in your library with the same name, non-land specifically. So every single blue-red deck would be able to companion Lutri for free. It would not change the metagame, it would not change which decks are viable, but every single blue-red deck strategically, optimally will be playing it, and it would be widespread across every single blue-red deck on this list. Kraum, Rogsai, Sisei, Rog Thrasios, Najila, Kenrith, Malcolm Vile. Every single one of those decks would play it. All the other decks would not. It's just strong to have. Lutri, when it enters the battlefield, copies a instant or sorcery that you cast, but it only copies it if you cast it. So this does not go infinite with Twin Flame. It's not another copy of Dualcaster Mage. Most often what I saw Lutri when I was playing no ban list is 3 mana, put Lutri to hand, and then you pitch it to Force of Will later on. But it's strong. Like, the card would definitely be played, and people would companion it and move it to their hand, and then have a 3 mana second copy of whatever counterspell. But it's not strong enough to make a material impact on the metagame. You guys should mostly be familiar with Mana Crypt because it was just legal. I'm also going to talk about Moxen in the same paragraph. The introduction of 1 copy of Mana Crypt or any individual Mox is not going to fundamentally change the format. Fast Mana already is present. Mox Diamond, Chrome Mox, Mox Opal, Soul Ring. These cards already exist in cEDH, and we know what they do. You guys are familiar with the Mana Vaults, the Grim Monoliths, all this type of stuff. Mana Crypt, obviously, very strong, leads to a ton of very explosive starts. in Commander, Mana Crypt is stronger than Moxen. It just plain and simply is. The Moxen are banned, but if you're only talking about introducing any individual Mox, even if it was just you only could play one Mox and it's the Mox of the color you wanted it to be, so like Kinnan would get the blue one and Magda would get the red one, whatever, Mana Crypt is still just a better card because, once again, the gate in this format is mana, and Mana Crypt makes 2, Moxen make 1. The colors are nice. It's nice that it makes a color. That is not a materially relevant portion of the text on either of these cards. It's the fact that Mana Crypt makes 2 and Moxen make 1. Soul Ring also makes 1, for what it's worth, the turn it comes down. Moxen are stronger than Soul Ring in that specific context, but Soul Ring is probably still better than Moxen because 2 mana every turn is better than 1 mana every turn. If you were to say that Moxen had to be unbanned as a group of 5, it would be a tier 1 card, for sure. 5 Moxen being introduced into this format would warp the format entirely. Mana would become it would be so hard to justify playing only 1 Mox in a 1-color deck when instead you could have 5 Moxen in a Kenrith deck. Decks would be super centralized around playing cards that draw cards because the ability to convert cards to mana just went up by at least 5% when you add 5 Moxen to your deck. Very, very, very strong if it comes in groups of 5, but we know what Mana Crypt does. You've seen that card before. It would absolutely, be played at a very high level and, would be relevant and a lot of people would play it, but it wouldn't fundamentally change what cEDH looks like, and the same is true of the Moxen. Paradox Engine, some of you can think back far enough. Paradox cEDH, Paradox Arkham. There's a couple decks that would become a lot stronger if they had access to Paradox Engine. These are commanders that tap and have activated abilities when they tap. Especially those two can tutor Paradox Engine, so they create, build your own engine, basically, an engine of the Paradox variety. Paradox Engine used to be a part of PST, Paradox Scepter Thrasios decks. So back when Timothy Thrasios was king of the world, pre-Dockside, pre-Breach, Paradox Engine was played with Isochron Scepter Dramatic Reversal, and basically the idea was you play a bunch of rocks, and then you untap them with Paradox Engine or the Dramatic Scepter, and then you outlet all of that into Thrasios. That would still be a deck. Maybe not the Scepter part of it, but definitely the Paradox Thrasios deck, absolutely a viable deck and would see a lot of play. Paradox Engine, setting aside any concerns or constraints that we have about how much time it takes to resolve this card's very strong. It would absolutely see play. Decks like cEDH and Arkham would definitely have a resurgence. It would definitely see play in Kinnan. It would definitely see play in Timothy Thrasios. Probably see play in Magda. Magda finds artifacts. It's an artifact. Surely there's something Magda can do that's broken with it. I don't know. I think Paradox Engine is legendary, so it could be tutored for in cEDH if you wanted, which it is legendary, so yes, you can. If cEDH cast, I'm certain there's a bunch of decks that would find a way to use it. Derevi, of course, strong with it because you can cast your commander and it untaps things. It's going to see play. It's not going to, break the format or anything, but it would definitely see play, and it's definitely strong. Prophet of Kruphix, another card that would see play in all the decks I just talked about, and then some. Any deck that's playing Seaborn Muse right now would be playing... What happened to my... There we go. Any deck that's playing Seaborn Muse right now would play Prophet of Kruphix were it to be unbanned. It's Seaborn Muse, but it doesn't untap lands, and it does give creatures you control flash. So you have pretty nasty lines of play, like, tap 3 lands, 2 dorks, play Prophet, untap on your turn, cast Thrasios and Tymna. The following turn, activate Thrasios. The following turn, activate Thrasios, untap. Things like that are very, very strong. Obviously, Kinnan's going to love it. Getting to cast creatures at instant speed is really great. Card would be very strong. It would definitely see a lot of play. Any deck that plays Seaborn Muse would want to play Prophet of Kruphix, and Prophet's a little bit stronger because of the flash. Downside, does not untap lands. Or no, Prophet untaps, it's artifacts, excuse me. It does not, Prophet untaps lands and creatures, but it does not untap artifacts. So Mana Vault and Grim Monolith, those cards would not work with Prophet of Kruphix, but do work with Seaborn Muse. Time Walk, this card is Final Fortune, but it doesn't kill you, and it's not an instant. Time Walk, another card like Ancestral Recall that would see play in every single deck. There are 2 distinct combos with Time Walk that are worth mentioning. One of them, there's a Jeskai card that's 4 mana. When you cast your next instant or sorcery of the spell, return it to your hand. It's like a 2 mana, 2/3 or something, and then it's got that 4 mana activated ability, which is in Jeskai. So Jeskai plus Time Walk plus 6 mana wins you the game. The other one is a Seeker Walk combo, which comes from Canadian Highlander, I believe, where you can Spellseeker for Ephemerate, Ephemerate for Time Walk and Neoform. On the following turn, you Neoform your Spellseeker into Timeless Witness, which picks up Time Walk, and then you Ephemerate the Timeless Witness, or picks up Ephemerate, Timeless Witness, pick up Time Walk again, Ephemerate, target the thing, pick up Time Walk. It loops. It goes infinite. So if you're willing to play Ephemerate, Spellseeker, and Timeless Witness in your deck, you can play Time Walk combos that are assemblable off of Spellseeker. Otherwise, it's just a Final Fortune that doesn't kill you. Obviously, every single blue deck would start playing Time Walk, but it's not going to fundamentally change what the metagame looks like or what decks are viable. It's just a phenomenally powerful card that every deck should be playing and would be doing so. Yawgmoth's Bargain. This card splits the difference between the casting costs of Ad Nauseam and Peer into the Abyss. Yawgmoth's Bargain cannot be swatted like Peer into the Abyss can. Yawgmoth's Bargain does well versus instant speed draw hate, unlike Peer into the Abyss. So you can Yawgmoth's Bargain for 1. If they Bowmaster in response, you could just draw on top of the Bowmaster. It does not, unlike Ad Nauseam dodges Bowmaster entirely by just putting cards direct to hand. Yawgmoth's Bargain does not do that. So there's basically, that's the way that it would play out. It's going to see play in decks that are trying to do the Ad Nauseam thing. It probably would see play in Rogsai. If Peer into the Abyss does not see play in your deck, Yawgmoth's Bargain might, but it's iffy. It depends how many big, costing outlets to draw cards you are looking for. And now that we have Necropotence and Necrodominance, I think the stonks on Yawgmoth's Bargain go down a little bit from there. So I would not think that this is going to enable decks that don't exist, because Ad Nauseam is already the best thing to be doing with this, because your life total is typically so high. Necropotence, Necrodominance do a lot of what this card does anyways. It absolutely would see play, but it's not going to be warping anything. I'm going to get a drink of water, and then we're going to talk about Tier 1. There are 9 cards that would fundamentally change cEDH, the metagame, which decks are viable, if these cards were unbanned. The first one on this list, and arguably the least format warping of the cards on this list, Black Lotus. Black Lotus would make every deck way stronger. It would make decks very, very explosive. The deck most likely to have used Black Lotus, amusingly, well, not even amusingly, but like Black Lotus is really good with Silas Wren, because Silas Wren attacks an opponent with Death Touch and picks up Black Lotus. That's Rogsai. Rogsai would get a massive jolt. Plus 3 mana for 0, right? Culling the Weak is a poor man's impression of Black Lotus. Every single value engine in this format comes down off of Black Lotus by itself. Rhystic Study, Smothering Tithe, Trouble in Pairs, Timna, everything comes down off of Black Lotus. Black Lotus would increase the speed of this format at a rate meaningfully higher than Mana Crypt does, because it makes colored mana. You can, end step Enlightened Tutor or Vamp Tutor or Imperial Seal for Black Lotus, and you untap with 5 mana. That is 5 mana is Ad Nauseam mana. It's more mana than Mana Crypt. There's an argument to be made that this card belongs in Tier 2, but Black Lotus works with Breach and allows you to keep your hand. Black Lotus works with Auriok Salvagers, but allows you to keep your hand. Black Lotus is such a phenomenally powerful card that it absolutely would change the speed of the format by a meaningful and notable amount. Just itself being added to the format, because it would become, so highly sought after and tutored for. Dockside Extortionist, y'all know what this card does. Y'all know what this card will do if it was unbanned, because you played with it a month ago, 2 months ago. I legitimately don't know when those bans were. But anyways, Dockside, this card brings entire archetypes to the forefront of their strength. There were so many decks that revolved around doing the Dockside thing. if it were unbanned, it would fundamentally change which decks are viable and change the metagame to be based around replicating, copying, flickering, and reanimating Dockside Extortionist, just as it was before it was banned. Absolutely, it deserves its tier 1 spot on this list. Another card that from yesteryear, Flash. This card was banned in something like 2019, 2020. They swapped it and Protean Hulk. For a while, Protean Hulk was on the ban list and Flash was legal. Then they made Protean Hulk legal. Then they made Flash banned. Flash was banned because of it destroying cEDH. If you think the Born Upon the Wind, Valley Floodcaller play patterns are toxic, Flash puts all of those play patterns to shame. When you flash in Protean Hulk, you go and find something that basically cannot be interacted with, and it wins you the game. You find Thassa's Oracle, Nomad's Illusionist, and Nomad's Encore and Cephalid Illusionist. Those mill your library. In response to anything putting cards into your library, it mills your library. Interaction, you have to have interaction and Graveyard Hate together to beat this combo, because you have to remove one of the pieces once the library is empty and then refill the library back up. If you have any one of those pieces in your hand, you go find a Grand Abolisher instead with that pile, and then you just cast the other piece, unless the piece is if the piece isn't Thoracle. But the point is, Flash is egregiously strong. It allows you to win at instant speed, and while Flash was legal, play patterns were entirely around either winning with 2 mana at instant speed with no cards on board, or playing this Mexican standoff, guns pointed at everyone, who's going to cast the Flash first, because then you just get flashed on top of. And the deck best able to play the Flash holding pattern was Tymna Thrasios, because the best Flash pile is all in Bant. This card is absolutely going to fundamentally change the way the format is played, and every single deck that's playing at least Bant probably should now be playing Flash, and the entire format becomes around this Mexican standoff of who casts the instant speed win first. And now that we have Born in Valley Floodcaller, it's going to compound all of those things. So even more so than it is now, it's this constant showdown of who's going to go off first, and whoever doesn't, loses. And then you just do a grind value engine while everybody's pointing this gun at each other. It's a little nightmarish, and frankly, I'm personally sick of how the Born Upon the Wind Valley Floodcaller meta feels. Flash is like that, but amplified. And from turn 1 onwards, because it costs 2 mana to win the game with no cards on board. Flash is the most efficient win condition on a mana to card basis. Right? It costs 2 mana, and you need to have nothing in play. There are no other combos in this entire format for which that is true. 2 mana, no cards in play. Flash is the best way to win the game, and you can do it at instant speed. Hullbreacher. A lot of people probably remember Hullbreacher. This card was banned a few years ago. Hullbreacher lives in tier 1, even though Leovold does not, because Hullbreacher and Opposition Agent both came out of Commander Legends. And if you have both in play, your opponents have no meaningful ways to get the types of resources they need to remove them. With Op Agent, they can't tutor. With Hullbreacher, they can't draw. Unlike Leovold, which still allows your Mystics and Mystics to trigger on other people's turns, Hullbreacher does not. You cannot draw cards except for the one card you draw in every draw step. Combined with Wheels, Hullbreacher resembles a proactive A+B that basically wins you the game on the spot, because you make 21 treasures and get 7 fresh cards, as well as the single best piece you could have in play versus any of the value engine commanders in the metagame. Tymna, Crom, Tymna, Thrasios, Tivit, kind of. The Thrasios part of Rothras, Kenrith. I guess that's it. There's not that many commanders that draw cards here. But every single one of these decks should be playing Hullbreacher if they can. If you're in blue, you play Hullbreacher, because it basically disables the crazy value grind that all the decks are doing now. There's an argument to be made that we should have some recourse to just the endless card draw, and we kind of do. Like Notion Thief does exist, and Bowmasters is another way to punish it. If Hullbreacher or Bowmasters, talking about either of those two cards as being a part of the metagame, when they are present, they fundamentally change the way that people play. They change which decks are viable, and they change the strength of different types of decks. Hullbreacher, unlike Bowmasters, wins the game off of a wheel, where Bowmasters does not. And when all of your wheels, in your Rogside deck where you're already trying to, drop as many rocks as possible and spam out a ton of mana, all of those wheels also becoming win conditions, it's absurdly strong. Hullbreacher, absolutely a tier 1 card and would change the way that we play Magic. Karakas. This is an unassuming one. People talk about Karakas a lot. It is similar to Drannith Magistrate. The problem with Karakas is that all decks point is to play around their commander. And it takes only one Karakas to enter in a really obnoxious politics world where the first player to cast their commander gets it bounced. So nobody ends up playing their commander because they don't want to invest into a commander that then just gets bounced. But then one player with a Karakas can help keep an entire table hostage. And then when there's two players with Karakases, it's like a Drannith Magistrate in that nobody gets to have a commander. But also, not only does nobody get to have a commander, but you can't really easily get rid of it. Like, we don't play Strip Mine or Wasteland. Boseiju hitting non-basic lands would finally be relevant in being able to hit Karakas. Obviously, I said we're not talking about what happens if you unban 2 cards, but if you unbanned Golos and put Karakas into the metagame, that would be nightmarish because you just go find Karakas and shut out all of your opponent's commanders, and there's almost nothing in the entire metagame that can deal with it. There's an argument to be made that maybe, if Karakas is unbanned, that people would start playing non-basic hate, but I somewhat doubt it. I think, by and large, Karakas comes into play, and all of these decks now have this entire new axis that they need to start thinking about. And its cost of inclusion is so low, right? It's just a white land. It's basically a basic plains. Almost every single, every single 5-color deck could afford to play it, and they would choose to do so because the effect is so strong. Fundamentally change the way that we see and experience Commander and cEDH. Down to the final 4. Not that they're the 4 strongest, just down to the final 4. The first commander, the only commander in Tier 1, Nadu, Winged Wisdom. You guys remember Nadu. Nadu, I think, is one of the best decks in the format. I think it was certainly, I think that Timnacrom and Nadu were the 2 best decks in the format pre-ban, and I don't think it was close. You can argue with me about that, but I don't think it was close. Nadu was the only deck that I've ever played that made me go, yeah, I would be willing to give up Timnacrom in a max power competitive tournament for thousands of dollars because I think Nadu is just that strong. And that is still true. If Nadu was reintroduced back into Commander, it would become one of the best decks in the format again. Decks that do not have answers to the types of threats that Nadu presents would struggle. It would take up a massive meta share. It would see a ton of top performances. This deck is utterly obscene, and it doesn't matter how much you hate it out. Unlike, it's still just resilient enough to get there. So Nadu absolutely would change the way that cEDH is played and which decks are viable at the highest level. I'm going to pass Time Vault and Tinker and finish with those two because they're 2 of the most significant, impactful decks or cards that we could talk about. Talk about Tolarian Academy. This card is also ridiculous. It makes a ton of mana for very low input cost. We are already a format that plays a ton of 0 mana rocks. Every single blue deck would play this. If you think that Gaia's Cradle is already very strong, Tolarian Academy is Gaia's Cradle, but at 50% additional strength. When Rogsai gets access to a land that taps for 5 fucking mana and goes, Tolarian Academy, snap your anything, untap Tolarian Academy, frantic search, untap Tolarian Academy. I have 15 blue mana. There's nothing you can do. Timnacrom, Timothracios, Kinnan, all of these cards, all of these decks would play it. Tivit, for sure. Oh my god, Tivit makes Tolarian Academy tap for 5 by itself. It doesn't even need to do anything. Unless Tivit's an artifact, in which case it's 6. Tolarian Academy would instantly see play in every single blue deck, would make decks like Urza much stronger. Tolarian Academy is absolutely insane. Having a land that makes that much mana so trivially. Again, not that we have a legal Dockside Extortionist, but casting Dockside and then tapping Academy immediately afterwards wins the game pretty much no matter what's in your hand. That's an arbitrary amount of mana. Tolarian Academy, super nuts. I'm going to talk about Tinker first. A lot of people talk about Tinker. When they think about Tinker, they immediately think about Time Vault. Oh, you just Tinker for Time Vault and no ban list? That's completely wrong. What makes Tinker good is that it finds Bolas's Citadel. Bolas's Citadel is a 6-mana artifact that allows you to cast spells from the top of your library by paying life instead of their mana cost. If you put Tinker into this format, Rogsai wins on turn 2 in 95% of the games, because it can present a turn 2 Tinker for Bolas's Citadel in 95% of the games. Now, you might be thinking, well, what do you do with a Bolas's Citadel? The answer is cast every fucking spell. It doesn't matter. Any top deck tutor instantly wins the game because you can clear the top of your library with a card like Necropotence. The downside is that, counter spells and lands get stuck, but even if your Tinker for Bolas's Citadel, plays a land, plays a couple value rocks, and then passes, that's still very, very strong. And you untap and win the game almost every single time. Bolas's Citadel, absolutely absurd. It's like a 3-mana ad nauseum. Tinker is one of the absolute best things you could be doing. It's a 1-card win condition because it's basically a 3. Think about how strong ad nauseum would be if it was 3 mana. That's basically what Tinker is. And having Tinker in this format would speed the pace of the format up by an absolute massive amount, because instead of tutoring for ad nauseum as your fastest way to present a win, you're tutoring for Tinker. If you're not in black, there are other things you can do with Tinker. Portal to Phyrexia, blow up a bunch of creatures. The meanest thing you could do is God Pharaoh Statue. God Pharaoh Statue makes all of your opponent's spells cost 2 more to cast. So on turn 1, you go, land, Mox Diamond, Soul Ring, Tinker for God Pharaoh Statue, asymmetrical Trinisphere now for the rest of the game. Tinker is absolutely ridiculously powerful, and it's not because it finds Time Vault, it's because it finds Bolas's Citadel. So if we were to unban Tinker, the entire metagame would revolve around Tinkers. This card's utterly cracked. Last, certainly not least, the last card we're going to talk about, in a card very near and dear to my heart, Time Vault. I play Time Vault in Canadian Highlander. I own a Time Vault. Time Vault is the most powerful card in the format. More powerful than any other card on this list. Time Vault, there's a refrain that I heard from someone somewhere that basically said, if your format has Time Vault legal in it, your format becomes about Time Vault. And I don't think that is entirely wrong. Time Vault is a 2-mana artifact that if you untap, allows you, it's a 2-mana artifact that doesn't untap during your untap step and has tap take an extra turn. If you untap Time Vault with Manifold Key, Voltaic Servant, or anything else that untaps artifacts, you take infinite turns, and infinite turns wins the game. Time Vault is a 100% colorless combo. It's a 4-mana A plus B combo that costs 4 colorless mana, which means it goes in 100% of decks. Every single deck should play Time Vault. It also goes infinite with Derevi, by the way. If you didn't notice that, Derevi does untap Time Vault, does win the game on the spot. So Derevi would shoot up to a very high tier, although it already seems clearly it's already pretty good, but or at least it's very popular because this is a popularity metagame list, not a strength one. Yeah, Time Vault, if your deck is not supposed to play Time Vault, your deck is incorrect. You should be playing a deck that is supposed to play Time Vault. That is how warping Time Vault is. Blue-black has an A plus B combo that costs blue-blue-black, which is a significant cost. Time Vault wins off of land, Mana Vault, Mox, win. It wins by itself. Time Vault is egregious. It is unbelievably powerful. They will never unban it, but it is the best thing you could be doing because it's 4 colorless mana, A plus B, win the game in 100% of decks in this format. Every deck would play Time Vault, and the format would be about Time Vault. Cards would become viable because of Time Vault. Nature's Claim becomes a viable card when Time Vault's running around. Same with Tinker for that matter. Nature's Claim becomes a pretty good interaction spell if your opponents are constantly putting Bolas's Citadels into play on turns 1 and 2. And that's it. That's the list. We have 9 cards in Tier 1. We have 16 cards in Tier 2 and 16 cards in Tier 3. But yeah, fingers crossed. If we do some unbans and they all come from Tier 3, it'll be fun, neat toys, I think, for people to play with. If we see some unbans and they come from Tier 2, we're going to see a lot of, metagame shifts. There are going to be changes. There's going to be some interesting stuff. And then cEDH changes fundamentally at its base if we see the Tier 1 cards get unbanned. I would be very, very surprised if any of the cards on Tier 1 got unbanned because I think they are exceedingly warping for cEDH as a whole. And I also don't think we're ever going to see Power 9 unbanned because of just the secondary market components. And same with Library. This card's $1,000 and it's not legal. Library becomes legal and becomes an auto include in every single cEDH deck. This card spikes to 4,000 overnight. I mean, maybe not, but Time Twister is already like 4,000, and it is legal. So I don't know. That's what we got. Those are the tiers. These are the cards. Get in the comments. Let me know in which ways you think I'm wrong. I've had a lot of experience playing with these cards, but only in the context of no ban list. I've done a little bit of cEDH +1. In fact, I recommend you talk to your play group. If you want to play with some of these cards, you want to see how strong they are, talk about playing cEDH +1, where each player gets to pick one card off the ban list. If you really want to have fun, pick cards from tier 2. If you want to break something, pick cards from tier 1, because these tier 1 cards will break things. If you doubt how strong Time Vault or Tinker is, put it in your deck. I dare you. You'll figure it out. You'll discover. You'll see what happens to the format when these cards are unbanned. But yeah, that's what I got. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully you found this video interesting.